am live, I believe, yes. Today is Tuesday, and it is the 25th of June 2024. I'm reading The Laird and the Lady. It's a novel by Joan Marshall Grant. She passed away in 1989. This novel was published in 1949, and Joan used to write books about her previous incarnations. She had 7 incarnations a very long time ago in ancient Egypt and in Greece and in Italy. Anyhow, this is her one novel, and it's about Marylda and Rowan, and she is an American heiress, and he is an heir to a castle in the Highland of Scotland called Cloud. We are now following the trail of Emilie, who used to be married to Hector. Anyhow, she passed away, and there's a mystery. Emerald Green, Chapter 11. As the sound of the pipes faded into silence, Mr. Henderson found himself incapable of acting in the manner he used to consider appropriate after a funeral. He had an overwhelming desire for privacy, in which to sustain his intimation of immortality, and he offered a silent prayer to the close and friendly deity of whom he was for the first time aware, that Enid might be asleep before he reached the manse. He was too preoccupied to do more than murmur good night, and hurried away with his coat flapping, like the wings of a bird learning to fly. Marylda suddenly wanted Rowan with such intensity that she almost called his name aloud. If only Rowan was with her, instead of Duncan, she could cry on his shoulders until the tension relaxed. Rowan would comfort her as he had done after she fell in the river, as he had done when they found each other in France. Or why had he gone to Pidluck and left her alone? Duncan sensed that she found no comfort in him, and his feeling of inadequacy increased. What could he do to help her? Would she feel happier if he made her eat something? Ought he to insist on her having a hot bath as soon as they reached the castle? She must be frozen. Her thin sandals were soaked. She might at least have had the wit to see she put on proper shoes. Should he insist on staying the night in case she needed him? Marylda was aware of his agitation and found it annoying. Why couldn't he be cheerful and help her to put a barrier of triviality between experience too recent to be remembered in tranquility, and the ordeal of sleeping alone in a room divided only by a wall from another which had not been easy to enter? She was far too tired to cope with him. If he didn't come out of his gloom, she'd send him home. If he became sentimental, she would probably be angry, and then he'd expect sympathy. And if he offered sympathy to her, she was almost certain to cry, and he was always afraid of tears. She had had quite enough fear to fight against for one evening. When they reached the front door, he asked whether she'd like him to doss down in one of the spare bedrooms, and she said that it would be silly to annoy Rowan. He cursed himself for a tactless fool who had not even the decency to know when he wasn't wanted, and before she had time to explain that she wasn't ready to be alone, he got into his car and drove out of the courtyard. She stood forlorn in the great hall with Angela beside her, listening to the sound of the car as it turned through the gates which Emilie had brought from Italy. The castle had never seemed so vast, so echoing with dark corridors from which opened room after room, all of them empty except for those far away in the servants' wing, where 2 old women slept and would not waken even if she screamed. "Angela, does a man always leave a woman when she wants him most?" she said wistfully. "Robbie or I wouldn't let you have puppies alone, but most men expect sympathy for prowling up and down the corridors of nursing homes while their wives have babies. What would you feel like if I sent you to the vet and pretended that I couldn't bring myself to see you in pain? Angela whimpered and looked anxiously towards the staircase. She was not used to being up so late and wished to return to her basket. Marylda lit another cigarette. "We're not going to bed just yet, so don't be impatient. I may even make myself an omelette, and if you are good, I'll give you something interesting from the larder." She tried to be angry with Duncan. Any emotion was preferable to the self-pity which was creeping over her like a fog. She poured herself a stiff brandy and soda, but the nonchalance of the gesture became ineffective when the decanter clattered against the glass. "It's only a perfectly normal reaction," she explained to Angela. "If I belonged to the age when ladies could indulge in the vapors, I should have had a nice cry by now and be reveling in the sense of virtue rewarded with a whiff of smelling salts and lavender water on the temples to bolster my feminine ego. But as we belong to a time when men expect their females to be tough and then grumble because their vanity isn't cosseted, we shall have to look after ourselves and try to like it." Angela licked her hand, squirming in an ecstasy of her devotion. "We can't stay close here much longer, my dear. We can't stay down here much longer, my love. Sandy has probably forgotten to tell someone to make up the boiler, but we can at least try for a bath." She took some more brandy to stave off the moment when she must go upstairs. Angela never trusts to male intuition. Either they haven't got any, or they're too lazy to use it. I know it sounds cynical, but could I be honest and say less? Surely Duncan ought to have guessed that it wasn't very cozy to be left alone. Even after the most orthodox funerals, there's a party to cheer up the mourners. And without being fussy, I think I deserve a little consideration when I've acted a pallbearer, chief mourner, and corpse at the same time. Angela thumped her tail on the sofa cushions to indicate approval. "You agree? Well, remember what I've told you when Jock tries to make you feel inefficient because you've got too much sense to carry a bundle of wet feathers in your mouth. Men are much more silly than women, which is why women have to exhaust themselves by weaving pink celluloid rattles to keep them in a reasonably good temper." In the confidence of the perennial battle of women against men, Marylda began to feel more bold. Why was she shivering by a dying fire because Duncan had deliberately abandoned her? Why was she in the shaming position of needing Duncan? Because her husband preferred to exchange dreary stories with Bruce Coyner instead of helping her to deal with his family spooks? She left all the lights on, trying to believe she did so only as a gesture against Rowan's ingrained habit of turning them off for the sake of economy. Anyone who had watched her sweep up the stairs, her head high, her dog beside her, would not have guessed that she walked imperiously because she would otherwise have been too difficult to leave the seeming security of the hall. She suddenly noticed that her sandals were clogged with the soft mould of the burial ground. She pulled them off and threw them into the waste paper basket. She was no longer afraid of Emilie, except in so far as everyone is afraid of certain traits of character. So why was she nervous? But Marylda was too familiar with the need for lies to seek comfort in lying to herself. She was frightened because she knew that she could hope for no one more than a breathing space before she must further extend herself to free Hector. But not yet. Please not until I can ask Rowan to help me. An owl screeched, and though she knew it was only an owl, she ran into the bathroom and slammed the door. She turned on the bath, and soft amber-colored water gushed from the tap with a heartening steam. At least Sandy had remembered to stoke the boiler. Men were not entirely useless. Angela took up her usual position, chin resting on the marble rim, watching for an opportunity to lick the wet shoulder of her mistress. Ignored, she put her head on one side, a gesture that seldom failed to draw attention. But Marylda was washing too vigorously to notice her. "Will I ever feel clean again?" she thought, scrubbing her nails with a fever that a doctor would have not thought inadequate after doing a post-mortem without gloves. She glanced over her shoulder at the ring and necklace, which she had put on the glass shelf beside the basin. "You need a thorough wash too," she said defensively. "You'll have to make do with eau de cologne. Georgina uses methylated for her diamonds, but if you think I'm going to the butler's pantry to fetch it, you couldn't be more wrong." She got out of the bath and wrapped herself in a towel. Then she picked up the emeralds between finger and thumb, dropped them into the basin and turned on the cold tap. A grey scum rose slowly to the surface. Dust, only dust, of course it wasn't particles of skin. She left wet footprints in the thick carpet as she fetched cologne from her dressing table, a new toothbrush from one of the mirror-fronted cupboards. The elaborate setting of the necklace seemed to move with a life of its own, as though the stones were segments of a green snake coiling to strike. She scrubbed it with spirit, with soap, and finally poured a bottle of Listerine over it. The emerald of the ring seemed penetrating as the single eye of Cyclops. The eye in the forehead, the eye which sees those things which the materialist denies. The impulse to hide the Cadre emeralds in a locked drawer, or throw them out of the window, was sufficiently insistent to demand that she prove her courage by wearing them to bed. I make a pause here in this chapter and continue soonest.